Boethius was at the height of his life with worldly success as consul and the second most powerful man in post-imperial Rome. 1 year later, he was imprisoned and in the pits of despair with the need of consolation. He was then executed only 2 years after his peak of power. During his imprisonment, he pondered deeply on the concepts of fortune, free will, and on the purpose of virtue. He sought to see the reason for why fortune's wheel continues spinning and how fortune cannot be the basis of one's goodness. He has heavy influence from Neoplatonism. This essay will seek to provide a general explanation of his work and some insights into its thoughts and significance as a great piece of philosophy which undoubtedly all should read. He had immense influence on the medieval world, which followed his death, with the Consolation of Philosophy being the second most read book to the Bible in readership during the medieval era. To quote the Penguin History of the World, Boethius is the most important single figure through whom the legacy of the classical world passed on into the medieval era. As a prerequisite for any sound philosophy, Boethius provides an account of order and his conception of metaphysics. He states that divine laws ensure an ordered creation and that they are the guiding principle in nature. He uses his poems in Book 1 as allusions to cyclical patterns in nature, like the seasons and the days, and how the sun sets and falls, and other things in nature that end in the same way in which they begin, which are parallels to fortune and much of human experience. For nothing keeps the order it receives except in its rising and falling. It bends and makes itself a circle without end, to quote Boethius. The order of nature is for all things to rise and fall and to return to their origin. This culminates in lady philosophy, showing that the beginning and the end are both synonymous in goal and purpose. The finalized purpose of all things is to achieve God's purpose in its creation and to fully actualize its nature for human participation within the divine nature. This is our end, who sets our source and maker, Lord and path and goal. Book 3, Chapter 9. This idea of the source and end being the same finds its origin in Revelation, where Christ declares himself the Alpha and the Omega. These two being the same is a pronouncement of pure act, in the sense that God has no potentiality of change from the beginning to the end, so these things are synonymous and the same. He also seems to argue for divine simplicity, in which the attributes of God are only nominally distinct, but not distinct in substance and in essence. This conclusion too is inescapable. Sufficiency, power, glory, reverence, and happiness differ in name, but not in substance. This is found in Book 3, Chapter 9 of the Consolations of Philosophy. All things are ordered, and due to this, chance is denied to exist, because chance arises only from events without any origin or predeterminate cause that is known to the subject. I bring what is bottom to the top and the top to the bottom. Book 2, Chapter 2 of the Consolations of Philosophy. Boethius' upbringing was rooted in his fortune of being born to the affluent and noble Anisi family, and then being adopted into the Symarchy. In his younger years, he was tutored on the classics, which led to his translations of much of both Plato's and Aristotle's corpuses. He later felt a sort of Platonic philosopher-king urge to enter into governance and to be a just ruler. He states in the Consolation that he sought the means of engaging in politics so that virtue may not grow old and unappraised. His efforts were not in vain, with his actions to root out corruption in the Roman courts. This plan and his close relationship with Constantinople led to his fall from power, imprisonment, and ultimately his death. This course of his life is where his view of fortune finds its source. Fortune is personified as a woman who is constantly turning the wheel of fortune, causing the rising and falling of all equality and impartiality. He rejects that fortune favors the good alone and asserts in his view that it is blind, which can be seen in evil people possessing great material goods. He goes on to contrast material and spiritual goods, which we will speak about later. Continuing his discussion on fortune, he shows that, like all worldly things, it is fleeting. And for that reason, we should not search it out over the importance of self-cultivated virtues, with even a claim that bad fortune is better than good fortune, as a means of understanding. To quote Book 2, Chapter 8, good fortune deceives, bad fortune enlightens. In his life, he was deceived partially by material trappings that do not belong to him because they have a fleeting nature which arose due to good fortune. But now that he has fallen in bad fortune in his imprisonment, he sees his true nature of being a force that equalizes and does not allow one to attain true happiness. Happiness must be attained only in that which is unchanging and constant. Ultimately, fortune in Boethius' view is a constantly changing force that does not cease in its changing. This view of fortune is reminiscent of Heraclitus' view of nature, the only constant in it being change. To quote Book 2, Chapter 3, in law eternal, it lies decreed that naught from change is ever freed. Nothing in human relations is free of change that is reliant upon the world and on subjective human interpretation and experience. Now that Boethius has given an account of fortune and demonstrated that it is not a force that acts as a benefit or reward for good men, but as a sort of cycle that is impartial and that it just acts blindly, he must give his own account of both the relation of goods to fortune and of virtue. Boethius demonstrates how material possessions cannot be deemed as good, given that they firstly do not have goodness in themselves, and that they derive their goodness from their utility and not from their mere existence. Secondly, he must provide an explanation that man's real worth and goodness is based in our conception being made in the image of God and not in material ownership or possession of things deemed to grant goodness. Indeed, the condition of human nature is based on our role as the capstone of creation. And when we relate our worth to things lesser of ourselves in creation, we lessen our own personal worth and create humans that are seen purely as means to an end, and as Kant would say, not ends in and of themselves. This creates a dichotomy between material and spiritual within Boethius that can be seen evidently through not just Neoplatonic or in Christian philosophy, but in all philosophy. Lady philosophy in her care given to Boethius shows evidently that the mental and spiritual concerns are of greater importance than the physical and material distractions. To quote Book 1, Chapter 2, when the storms of life inflate the weight of earthly care, the mind forgets its inward light. This ideal is reminiscent and inspired by the contemplation of the forms. When one ceases to seek understanding of the ideals of goodness and the like, he ceases his wishes to transcend purely physical needs. The unexamined life is not worth living, as Socrates would say. Virtue cannot properly be attributed to fortune, due to the fact that it comes from an inward desire for goodness and not from outward forces acting upon an individual. Virtue in the past men commit to come only as a means in the search of happiness, which is deduced to only be found in the ultimate good. Ultimate good is defined as that which, to quote Book 3, Chapter 2, is the perfection of all good things and contains in itself all that is good. This is similar to someone like St. Anselm's account of God as the greatest conceivable possible being, which has issues given that it creates God as just the pinnacle of being and not being himself. But that's beside the point. Ultimately, the main point of this is that, like Plato, the good, the ultimate good, is identifiable with God. The hearts of men fall into error, and their paths cause for different means to reach the ultimate, and in some of them, relating the means to the end. For example, power is important only to the extent that it is able to grant superiority and in its ability to reach certain ends, but not in itself, because it cannot grant true self-sufficiency, because you as a person are now become dependent upon the utility of power and not within yourself. So you cannot become self-sufficient through power. To quote Book 3, Chapter 2, because it is their conviction that through them they will be able to achieve self-sufficiencies, these things being respect, power, celebrity, and happiness. These things lead only to more want, because even in the possession of these things, one still lacks self-sufficiency, because they are reliant upon these things for fulfillment, which only leaves them wanting more. Honors and respects are of no importance for self-sufficiency, because they require other people to confer them upon you. Power cannot be the source of self-sufficient happiness because any fluctuation in power will confer a change in happiness. Politics cannot be one source of happiness because it is a game of power and will continue to have extreme volatility, which will become an extremely volatile happiness. Quote Book 3, Chapter 5. He illustrated the fears of kinship to Damocles by making a sword dangle over his head by a single hair. Such is the result of the game of power, of competing forces attempting to overcome each other at every constant moment, with a single hair preventing complete disaster. A king's power is dependent upon the people who serve him, which is another example of the many reciprocal relationships and the circular order that makes up this book. The pagan conception of the importance of fame, the immortality that one can gain, is utterly destroyed by Boethius through his two main contentions, those being the eventual forgetting of all that is not eternal, and secondly, its reliance on others as a source of his existence, which causes it also to become fallible and subject to an eventual falling away. The end of pleasure is sorrow. Pleasure cannot be one's ultimate source of happiness because it is simply gratification in the passions, a reward for wickedness. Addictions that arise from the passions are shown to not be able to bring about long-term happiness in an individual and make the person dependent on their addiction. To quote St. Augustine, habit when not resisted soon becomes necessity. Both modern psychological science and the Christian worldview support the idea of pleasure being the source of one's happiness in the long term, leading primarily to dopamine resistance and an escalation to more extreme vices and addictions to maintain personal gratifications. But in their blindness, they do not know where lies the good they seek. That which is higher in the sky, on earth below they seek. It is this continuation of Platonism which defines much of this book, that truth and goodness cannot be found in the fleetingness of this world, but in the internal being of the ultimate good, God. The Neoplatonic influences on Boethius is evident, with his account of imperfection as simply a deprivation of goodness and not as a separate substance. True happiness is to be found within God. The reason for our desire for things is due to the good that comes about from it, not the thing itself. The reason one might desire to work out is not for the act of exercising, but for the resultant good that comes about from it. So we see in the world all things that we see as good, almost all of them, we see them as purely means to an end of goodness. But the only place where we can find both the means and the end being the same, that being goodness, is in the ultimate good, God. The problem of free will and divine foreknowledge and causation is a mainstay in all philosophical and theological discussions. It was Boethius' plan to solve this problem by showing that God was not causing our actions. He starts by defining the distinction between providence and fate. Providence is defined as the unchanged, overarching plan of God and divine reason itself, so essentially the Logos. Providence can be seen in God's purposes in the creation of natures. Fate is defined as the planned order in things subject to change and of the relation of elements in which things change. Chance, being defined as an event without any cause, is denied to be the true definition of cause, because all events are caused by a preceding cause. But chance goes against this and brings randomness into the equation, which disrupts the real order of reality that can be seen. Chance is now seen as an unforeseen consequence of actions, is accepted as a definition, and is borrowed from Aristotle. The freedom of the will is affirmed to exist by Boethius. It is said that the free will arises from man's rational nature, which gives rise to judgments, and from judgment, free will. In the contemplation of God, men are able to become more free of will because they are no longer being controlled by earthly desires of flesh and blood, which are closer to the deterministic of being of animals and such. Because, firstly, you begin to lack the rationality which enables you to have proper sound judgments. Secondly, all that you do comes from fleshly desires within you without the proper sense of decision and choice of will. The conflict of free will and divine foreknowledge is asked by Boethius to lay philosophy in this way. If God foresees all things and cannot be mistaken in any way, what providence has foreseen as a future event must happen. That is in Book 5, Chapter 3 of the Consolation. Later philosophy goes into the eventual side effects of determinism, if it is accepted, by showing how moral responsibility is relinquished if all actions are causally determined by God, and not the free will of the individual. The first way for knowledge and free will are reconciled is by showing that just as knowledge of present things does not bear a necessity on what is happening, so does foreknowledge not bear any necessity on what will happen. God exists in the eternal present, which is a concept borrowed by Augustine. So, all things are currently happening, and the knowledge of a present thing does not entail necessity. Necessity is distinguished into two types. Necessity in a simple sense, such as man is mortal, and necessity in a conditional sense, such as if I know that someone is walking, he necessarily is walking. Providence sees things as a conditional necessity, not as a simple necessity. When considered by themselves, that which arises from conditional necessity is predicated only on the free choice of the individual, but not on the knowledge that is its byproduct.